maybe let's start with autism terminology, because that has been something that you've made videos about as
Yeah,
well.
yeah,
Maybe,
and that's something that's definitely changed a lot.
yeah, maybe like the first obvious one, Asperger's versus autistic.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, that one. Maybe you can just really quick tell us
Yeah. Okay.
what
So
the difference there is.
what the difference is? Yeah. So there are two simultaneous kind of paths that takes. One is the diagnostic, and one is the social narrative, right? So if we take the diagnostic first, there are two different diagnostic systems in the world. One is the DSM system, which is the one used in the United States and also in research for the most part. It's the DSM system. The DSM system was updated in 2013, I believe. And at that point, in that system, the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis was incorporated into autism spectrum disorder. In the other system that exists, which is the
Sorry.
ICD. Yeah,
Incorporated as in put in there,
yeah,
and
so
we don't talk about Asperger's anymore.
yeah, so it's not a separate diagnosis. It's now just a part of autism. So it's not that those who were diagnosed with Asperger's are now not anymore. It's that if you get a diagnosis after that point in time, if you are in a country that uses the DSM system, you won't be getting an Asperger's diagnosis. If that was what you would previously qualify for, you would now get an autism spectrum
Mm-hmm.
disorder level 1, 2, or 3.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the DSM system, because there's also another system, which is the ICD. And the ICD system, it was only updated in 2021, but it's international. And because it's international, it has to be translated into each language, and that translation has to be verified in order for the ICD, the new ICD edition, to take effect in that country. So in Denmark, where I'm located, the old ICD system, which is from 1994, is still active. That's the ICD-10. The ICD-11 is out, and Asperger's, just like in the DSM system, should be incorporated into autism spectrum disorder. But because the translation hasn't been verified yet for ICD-11, we're still using ICD-10 to diagnose, which means that in Denmark, you can still get an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis. And that, of course, creates some issues because on the social narrative side, um, in the last 10 years, I would say, some things have surfaced about the man whose name is attached to that diagnosis. And I don't want to get into specifics, but Hans Asperger uh,
Was not a very nice
created
man.
he created the diagnosis during World War II. And the political influences during that time definitely had an impact. And so now the name Asperger's um, is now associated with that, which means, of course, that socially, um, if we're talking social media and the larger narrative, saying that you're an Aspie or Asperger is now no longer going to be received very well. So if you've gotten an Asperger's diagnosis, which is still my official diagnosis because I was diagnosed, you know, even before the DSM was updated, um, So that is officially my diagnosis. I can't change that. I would qualify for an autism diagnosis, and so I feel comfortable saying that I'm autistic. But for a long time, during that shift, it was hard to navigate. Do I still call myself an Aspie? Do I change that language to say that I'm autistic? Um, is that truthful considering the diagnosis, or is it? It was a lot of thoughts to navigate, and I think for a lot of people, not just for me as a person, but for everyone who was diagnosed before those shifts happened, and before that terminology change, it does, present a challenge as to what terminology to use.
I have a few questions, just
Of course.
maybe because so firstly, this change in terminology, is it
Mhm.
purely a historical reasoning behind it? I mean, to me, just making, was there already autism diagnosis, like autism as a category, did that exist at the time that you were diagnosed? And did the diagnosis say,
Yeah.
no, Maya doesn't have autism, she has Asperger's? And what would be the difference that was made there in regards
No,
to the diagnosis?
no. So the thing is, in the ICD 10, which, as I said, is still in use in Denmark, because the translation has not been verified for the ICD 11 version yet. There are different diagnoses that are within the autism spectrum. It's not labeled as such in the diagnostic system, but it has been acknowledged in psychology and psychiatry for a very long time that these are kind of related diagnoses, that they don't have that many differences, but they are different, apparently, at the time. That was the thinking anyway. So we had Asperger's syndrome, we had infantile autism, and we shorten it to GUA. So it's a generalized developmental disorder other, which that one was kind of the, okay, so you're autistic, but you don't really fit the criteria, so we're going to put you in that box instead. The difference between Asperger's syndrome and infantile autism, diagnostically speaking, is if there was a language development detectable before age 3, you would be put in the infantile autism category. And if there was not a language development, then it was Asperger's.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Diagnostically, that's the difference. I will say that among many professionals, that also generally translates into, if there is an intellectual disability, that also goes into infantile autism. So we used to say that infantile autism would be average to lower cognitive ability, and Asperger's would be average and up.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when we then, and I say we, I had nothing to do with it, obviously, but when the diagnostic systems made the change was simply to say that we no longer differentiate strictly between these diagnoses, and instead we're going to put them into one diagnosis and then have it be more descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
So the DSM-5 system, which is the current system, you have ASD, autism spectrum disorder, levels 1, 2, 3, wherein the levels uh, do not specify. Sometimes people will say that it's about the severity of the autism, but it's not. It's actually, I don't even like that terminology, but it's referring to the support needs.
Mm-hmm.
And the diagnostic system actually acknowledges that support needs can change.
Mm-hmm.
So your support needs can increase or decrease. and that is built into the diagnostic system. And then a part of that diagnosis is now also that you specify whether or not there was a language development delay, or if there are sensory processing differences, all of those things. You're supposed to specify it along with the diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just say, okay, so it's this diagnosis, done. And the idea is very much the same in ICD 11. It's just that in some in some countries it's not in effect yet.
Mhm. Okay,
Did I
but
answer the question?
no, you
Okay.
answered it perfectly. So, as far as I understand, I guess that you broadly agree with the DSM. So you broadly agree with um, removing the old categories and just putting the umbrella term autism on top of it with
Yeah,
the
because
different
we
levels.
already knew we already knew kind of that it was a spectrum, and that the diagnoses were connected.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really make the distinction. It wasn't. No, I guess I don't want to generalize here, because some professionals definitely did um, put these groups into separate boxes, but generally, it was acknowledged for a very long time clinically
Mm-hmm.
that autism was a spectrum, and that these diagnoses fit into that spectrum, all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, professionals, psychologists and psychiatrists and researchers recognize that we don't know everything. We are continuously seeking new knowledge, seeking better ways to describe things. We're seeking to develop our professional view on things
Mm-hmm.
through learning about all the differences that exist.
You've already mentioned that you have a problem with the term with saying that the levels imply
Mhm.
severity. I guess you have a problem with the words severity. And what about saying having autism? Is that also that you something that you would reject? Or
Um, so I think that when we talk about person first and identity first language, that's an individual choice. As a community, largely autistic people prefer identity first language, which is autistic person, right? So you put the autism and then person, right?
Mhm,
Um, for a very, very long time, and a lot of professionals still cling on to this, person first language was preferred. So that is person with autism, right? As a community, autistic people tend to prefer identity first, but there are definitely individuals out there. I saw one person on Threads, I think it was yesterday, say, I don't feel comfortable with that. I prefer saying that I have autism. And I think that is perfectly valid. People perceive the meaning of language differently.
mhm,
And it's perfectly okay for someone to say, I don't feel comfortable identifying myself with the diagnosis. That's not who I am. Um, some people find it dehumanizing. That's okay. Um, but I do acknowledge, and I think it is important to acknowledge, that generally speaking, the majority prefer the identity first
mhm. So you
knowledge.
wouldn't have a very strong opinion about
No,
either
no,
of,
no,
of those.
no,
You
no.
called yourself an Aspie at some point, and you had a
I did.
video. You had a video where you were basically, yeah, arguing with people that were angry about you calling yourself an Aspie. First of
Yeah.
all, how do you did you ever rewatch that video?
I generally don't watch anything that I've recorded. I don't like hearing myself speak.
Hmm.
So I have a very, very hard time with that. So why I don't edit anything. I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot rewatch myself. Um, but I do kind of generally remember why I recorded that video. And that video, as I remember it, came from parents of autistic children complaining that I was using identity first language.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, I was using the term Aspie, which of course today would be autistic. I'm not clinging on to the specific term. For me, the difference was in the identity first versus the person first.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that irked me and the thing that always kind of upsets me is when an outsider tries to tell me how I should talk about my own diagnosis. So if someone who is not autistic tells me how I should use language about autism, that to me is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Always like, oh, in all areas. I feel, I don't know if I agree with
n-
that.
uh, there are probably exceptions. For me,
Because I
it might be a rebellious thing. Like, you don't
mm-hmm.
get to tell me who I am.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to tell me how I should talk about myself.
Yeah.
You get to present arguments, and I will listen to your arguments, but I feel like someone ordering me to change my language, which is what
Mm-hmm.
had happened at the time. It was like, you are not allowed to do this. This is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was. I don't remember the wording of the comment that I got, but I remember the gist, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to me was what I needed to address is,
I'm just thinking about self-demeaning behavior. We sometimes engage in self-demeaning
of course,
behavior
of course.
or talk, and then somebody else who's not us can rightfully so point out this self-demeaning. I'm not saying that you did that in that instance. I just, as a
No,
general idea,
no,
I feel
I
like
get
that's
what you're
possible.
saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I think that there's just a way to address that is a little bit more empathetic
Mm-hmm.
to the person who is speaking about themselves in a demeaning way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I have a client who says about themselves, I'm stupid, or um, I'll never amount to anything, or I'm ugly, or whatever they might have, I'm worthless is something I hear a lot. And for me, the statement isn't the thing to combat. The statement isn't the thing for me to correct. For me, it's about, why are you saying that about yourself? What are the beliefs and experiences that build those beliefs for you? And how can we change that for you? How can we change the way you think about yourself so that you begin to build yourself up?
Mm-hmm. I guess,
And
sure.
and again, like, people perceive language and the meaning of language differently, and I definitely think a lot of parents and professionals were told that person first language is the correct thing to do, and that identity first language is dehumanizing. They were told that. And it's been drilled into a lot of people's heads. Um, but I also think we have to acknowledge that the autistic community came back, of course, not as a monolith, because we are not, but came back with a solid argument that said, no, actually, autism is something we're born with. And it's something that shapes the way we perceive the world from the time we're born. It's something that is so inherently a part of us that, it's like, for me, it's like saying I'm a woman, I'm a Dane, these are just facts about
You're a what? They? What's
a
it?
Dane, a
Ah, a
Danish
Danish
person.
person. Okay, yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So, um, so
But
they're
I feel
just
like
facts about me.
yeah,
They're
sure,
just
sure. Sure, I agree, but and I guess being Danish or being a woman or all of that is also shaping like every experience that you have. Like I feel like
it will,
everything is like shaping everything.
of course.
That
Yeah.
I kind of see the point. I don't really like to get fixated uh on speech so much, but I kind of get the point of the people that are saying you're making this your identity and this is basically like a label that you put on yourself and basically it reinforces this shaping like now not only it is shaping all of the experiences, now you've also additionally added a label on top of yourself
Mm.
which makes this shaping everything that you experience even stronger, which is like a kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Be-
Potentially, yes. I
Mhm.
definitely see where you're coming from with that. I also think that just in receiving the diagnosis, that kind of already happens. So to me, and this of course is just a matter of how you perceive, the meaning of words being strung together in a particular manner. Um, but for me, when I hear person with autism, um, I I hear, you know, okay, so this is a person and they have this thing called autism. It's like baggage they're dragging along, or it's like um, someone has asthma, you know, or someone has cancer, someone has depression as well, which is something we acknowledge as a mental illness that we can cure for the most part. And autism for me doesn't belong in that category. It belongs in the category of this is a part of who I am, and it is something to be acknowledged and accepted and loved.
A trait rather than
Yes.
yeah, I see what you mean, rather than a disease or a
Yeah.
disorder. Okay.
Yeah. And that I think was the main argument that the autistic community came back with, was like, we don't want autism to be perceived as a disease or a disorder that we have.
Hmm.
We want to be acknowledged as valuable people that exist in this world, um, and have every bit as much right to be here the way we are, as long as we're not hurting anyone. And that of course is the limit, where autism is like, I definitely see some people use, and this is regardless of terminology, but some people will be like, I'm autistic, so you have to automatically forgive me for being rude or for saying hurtful things, or you know
I mean, you kind of
and
do, right?
I mean, people make mistakes. And being autistic doesn't absolve you from saying, I'm sorry that hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt you. That I'll try to do
Hmm.
better, you know?